Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Aging Less, the Longevity Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Marie Stella, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hello and welcome back to the show. For centuries, tobacco has been considered to be dangerous to health. During the 1920s, the first medical reports linking smoking to lung cancer began to appear. And since then, some smokers, desperate to quit, have turned to e-cigarettes as a technological lifeline. That said, many have denounced e-cigarettes as a new front in the war on nicotine addiction. According to non-profit cancer charity organization Cancer Council Victoria, traditional cigarettes remain one of the leading causes of preventable death globally. Meanwhile, e-cigarettes, which were originally meant to be a tobacco replacement, are now being consumed for far more than just that. So in this episode, we seek to answer a pressing question. Are e-cigarettes actually a safer alternative? Joining us in this discussion is health researcher and injury prevention specialist Babac Salmani, who recently obtained a PhD at Western University. His research focuses on the health behavior change in the context of vaping, as well as the development and evaluation of digital tools to promote health outcomes. So we're extremely fortunate to have him on the show with us today. Welcome to the show, Babac.
Thank you so much for having me, Marie.
Yeah, I'm really keen to dive right into this topic with you today. But before that, do tell us about your background and what compelled you to specialize in injury prevention.
Yeah, of course. So, my background spans, public health, behavioral economics, chronic disease prevention, as you mentioned, in terms of injury prevention, kind of coupled into that. I've worked across sectors from academia to government, focusing on small changes in our environments and decision-making processes that can lead to hopefully better health outcomes in the population. And injury prevention for myself was really just a natural fit because it combined proactive education with this level of systems thinking to help reduce harm before it occurs. So whether it's road safety, whether it's physical activity or substance abuse like smoking and like vaping, it's about acting upstream before problems arise or crises, inevitably come up to front.
Yeah. And from what you've seen, what are the biggest mistakes that people make when trying to quit smoking?
Yeah, that's a great question. One major issue is the understanding of individuals relying on willpower alone. While some people can quit this way, there's a lot of evidence to show that success rates are much higher when combined with other treatments. So quitting smoking is a behavior change challenge. Not a character flaw. I think that's a really important thing that people should know when it comes to this type of maladaptive behavior. And people often underestimate the physiological, sometimes the psychological grip that nicotine can have on an individual. And another mistake is not using evidence-based supports like nicotine replacement therapy, or NRT as it's more commonly known, or prescription medications, even behavioral counseling. If it's available, they're all very effective and backed by evidence. And then a last part of that is that some turn to vaping without really even understanding its own set of risks. And it comes with the assumption that it's a harmless alternative, which we'll talk a bit about later on, but is an important factor when it comes to cessation from that behavior.
Yeah, for sure. And vaping hasn't really been around long enough for us to identify and confirm its long term effects. So, thanks for sharing that with us, Babak. That was a fascinating introduction for our topic for today. But before we go further into detail, I would love to get to know you better. So, this is Have You Met Babak? And my first question for you is, what is your favorite book?
My favorite book. I've gotten really into Audible lately, and I love to read. So one that's kind of hitting home more recently is the book called Nudge. It's by Thaler and Sunstein, and it transformed the way that I think about public health interventions. Rather than forcing change, what Sunstein and Thaler really want to, or what they did within this book, is that they wanted to emphasize designing choices that guide people gently towards better decisions rather than telling them what to do. Yeah. So that was a big book
Yeah.
for me.
That's really interesting. I've been meaning to get into Audible for years now, ever since like in the early YouTube days when big YouTubers were promoting it. But my brain just never really clicked. So, what is something that you do when listening to an audiobook?
Yeah, I think, for myself with a busy schedule, I tend to do it when I'm being physically active. So if I'm going for a run or if I'm doing weightlifting, that is usually when I'd put the Audible on. I also love podcasts. So maybe going on a long drive, if I'm tired of a specific podcast, I might move over to a nice Audible book that I've had saved for a while. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good tip. I haven't tried to do something else while listening to an audiobook, so that's potentially something that I'll try. And what about movies? What have you enjoyed recently?
Yeah, it's actually something that I just saw. It's not a very old movie, but it's an older movie. But it's always stuck with me is The Pursuit of Happiness, which I feel like a lot of people know. But if you haven't seen it, the story follows really a man facing this incredible adversity, financial hardship. He's facing housing insecurity. He's raising a child alone. Yet he refuses to kind of give up in this story. It's played by Will Smith, which fantastic actor, obviously. So that story itself is really a powerful portrait of resilience and the human spirit that I kind of stuck to. And the movie just reminds me that people often face invisible barriers. They lack real support, whether it's social, financial, or even institutional, in a lot of ways. And so, being able to emphasize that and to identify it really can make the difference. And it's a moving reminder that empathy and persistence and systematic change is a really important thing, not only at an individual level, but also for the public.
Yeah. And what about podcasts? You mentioned that you do listen to quite a few podcasts. So, what are you listening to at the moment?
Yeah, I've listened to Maintenance. I believe it's called Maintenance Phase, which is a fantastic podcast because it tackles health myths and misconceptions with a sharp but kind of this compassionate lens that I think is really important. And to me, it's just a good reminder that public health communication needs to be clear. It needs to be honest and really culturally sensitive. I think is an important factor that kind of goes missed in a lot of ways. And another one is actually Huberman Lab, if you've heard of it. So again, very popular podcast, but it dives into this, it deep dives really into this brain body conception and how they work together to shape behaviors like sleep, motivation, even addiction, right? So vaping and smoking being really consistent. And so, yeah, I just appreciate that bridge. Yeah.
Yeah, those are some really good picks, and I especially appreciate the bit about compassion. I feel like that's really that we really need more of that in today's society, not just with public health, but also with whatever it may be. Cancel culture is a huge thing at the moment, and in some circumstances, canceling is not necessarily like the best route. Like the crime doesn't quite match what has happened, I mean, sorry, not the crime, the punishment hasn't quite matched the crime. So I think that's something that we all need to consider, take a step back and think what it might be like to be on the receiving end of this as well. And yeah, so thanks for sharing that with us. And what about role models? Is there anyone that you've looked up to either in your professional or personal life?
Yeah, I mean, so many. you don't get the opportunity to be able to do post-secondary school, to work with really amazing colleagues without having a few role models to help you out along the way. I think from a foundational level, I would say my parents. They immigrated to Canada, which is where I am now, in the early 1990s and the late 80s, with a background in engineering, and their journey was always about perseverance, growth, and really just hardship. So for them, just seeing them kind of grow with integrity and resilience, and kind of this quiet leadership about them, is something that has always touched me and taught me about the foundations of how to be a good individual, but kind of bled into myself now as an injury prevention specialist, as a health promotion worker, as a teacher in a lot of ways. And so, building systems and habits that protect and uplift people is a really big piece that I learned from them. So all of the credit to them.
Oh, that's really sweet. Shout out to Mr. and Mrs. Salmani. Um, so my next question for you is, has there been a course or class that you've taken that has stuck with you to this date?
Yeah, I mean, sort of similar. There's so many, right? Some great courses, some not so great, but I would say one in particular is during my undergraduate degree, I took a course on behavioral economics and health promotion with an individual who ended up being my PhD supervisor, Dr. Mark Mitchell at Western University. And in that class, it challenged me in so many ways that to kind of move away from the traditional assumption that I had about people and their ability to make decisions. So, before that course, I kind of assumed, probably like many people, that if you provide people with the right information at the right time, in the right context, that they'll make the right decision. And quitting smoking is not uncommon from that. But the course really introduced me to decades of research showing that human decision making is far from purely rational. We're obviously influenced by emotions, by social norms, defaults. Even the framing of the choices, which is what behavioral economics is a big part of. And understanding these concepts like present bias, loss aversion, um, it can help, I guess, helps me anyway, think more critically about designing interventions now in a public setting that meet people where they are rather than where we assume they should be. And I was at a conference a few years ago, and this was the mantra that I kind of came out with it. And it was, in public health, we don't work for the community, we should be working with the community. And that is what reinforces supportive environments. That's what reinforces, long-term change.
Yeah, I love that so much. I find that profoundly admirable, the way that you have not only, exhibited compassion in your career, but also the unique intersection between behavior and public health that you found. That's just really interesting to me. So thank you for sharing more about yourself. I've really enjoyed my time getting to know you a bit better. So now I think it will be a good time to move on to our topic for the day, which is, are cigarettes a safer alternative? And for starters, I would like to start with defining some basic key terms. So, how would you define longevity?
Great question. Longevity is not just about lifespan, but health span, and I think that's missed a lot of the time. So, how long you live free from disability or chronic illness is an important consideration to make. So, obviously, longevity is influenced by genetics, but it's mostly influenced by lifestyle factors, things like diet, activity, substance use, social ties, healthcare access, right? Really, really simple things that build the foundation of longevity. So from a prevention lens, anything that reduces disease burden contributes to longevity. And while there's a number of studies that talk about it, but while genetics accounts for approximately 20 to 30% of lifespan variation, lifestyle and environmental factors can account for the remaining 70 to 80%, right? So these can include things like smoking and substance use, right? So leading to premature death, diet and physical activity. Um, you know,
Yeah. I totally understand what you mean. I mean, like, I've witnessed both. Used to have two of my grandmothers who passed away around the same time, but one of them was in like way more active than the other, was cycling up to about 2 to 5 years before her passing. And she only really
stopped being vital about 2 years before her passing, 1 or 2 years before. And the other grandmother I have wasn't as active, never has been that active, and she wasn't vital for a good 5 to 10 years. So the difference is really drastic. But the next thing I would love to ask you about is, how would you define smoking? Does it include vaping?
Mhm. Yeah, smoking, we'll start at a foundational level, I guess, typically refers to the inhaling of combusted tobacco. So this obviously releases chemicals like tar, like carbon monoxide, and unfortunately, over 7,000 other compounds, at least 70 of which we know are carcinogens. So things like benzene, things like nitrosamines, very harmful carcinogenic compounds. Vaping, or also referred to as e-cigarettes in a lot of ways, doesn't involve combustion, but still delivers nicotine and other chemicals via aerosol. So from a public health standpoint, we treat vaping as a form of smoking because it perpetuates, nicotine addiction. It poses really its own health risks, particularly among youth, which that's one thing I also want to really touch on. And it still delivers nicotine. It exposes users to potentially toxic compounds, including formaldehyde, acrolein, and a number of heavy metals, things like zinc, for example. Yeah.
Yeah. And how would you describe the relationship between smoking and longevity? What has the research shown us so far?
Yeah, there's a strong and really a well documented inverse relationship between smoking and longevity, as is not surprising, really. So, cigarette smoking remains the leading cause of preventable death worldwide. So it accounts for more than 8 million deaths annually. And that was a report by the WHO, the World Health Organization, in 2023 that reported on this. There was also a landmark study by Jaw in 2013, I believe, that found that current smokers in the US lose about 10 years of life expectancy compared to non-smokers. And, even the so-called, the light smokers, face significantly elevated risks of cardiovascular disease, of lung cancer. So yeah, one thing I think is really important to get across is that quitting at any age can lead to health benefits. So quitting before age 40 can reduce the risks of death associated with continued smoking by about 90%. Even quitting after the age of 60, has meaningful gains in life expectancy and quality of life as well.
Right, yeah, but if you can, don't wait until you're
Don't
past
wait.
60
Yes, please,
to
don't
quit.
Yeah.
And what about e-cigarettes? How can you elaborate more on how they differ from traditional tobacco products in terms of composition, use, and its effects on the human body from what we know?
Of course, yeah. So e-cigarettes are battery-powered devices that heat a liquid. So they usually contain, again, nicotine. They contain flavorings, solvents, and they do that to produce an aerosol. So unlike traditional cigarettes, they don't burn tobacco, so they avoid kind of producing tar and carbon monoxide. Again, two of the most dangerous elements of smoking. They have this sort of different chemical profile, but again, still produce harmful substances like formaldehyde, like acrolein, like other volatile organic compounds, metal particles as well, and they have different delivery mechanisms. So many modern vapes, for example, like a Juul, uses nicotine salts, which again they allow higher doses of nicotine to be delivered more smoothly, and in that case as well, it increases the risk of addiction and harm as well associated with nicotine.
Yeah. And what types of e-cigarettes are there? Are there like short-term and long-term health risks associated with specific types, or?
Yeah, so there's a number of different types of e-cigarettes for sure. There's, it started out, I believe they were called cigalikes. So this was kind of like this first generation, looked like the cigarettes, often disposable. From there, they moved to vape pens, and so these were these like refillable cartridges. They contained a tank, they contained a battery, and then I think earlier on in the early 2010s, I believe they had these mods which were customizable. They were higher power. They were used for this like cloud chasing phenomenon that really took with social media, unfortunately. And then we had this pod system, which is like these compact, these pre-filled cartridges. They look very sleek, very lean, kind of futuristic, and those are the Juuls. So those are the I guess, the more high-tech version and more perceivably, aesthetically pleasing.
Yeah. And what do you know about the differences between all of these? Like, do certain types produce more harmful effects?
Yeah, yes and no. So each differs in nicotine delivery, right? So power level, and again, the appeal, like the aesthetic piece. So Juuls, for example, they deliver high levels of nicotine salts, which are smoother to inhale, but again, highly addictive. And in terms of their overall effect, I think it's really important to consider, and it's commonly misunderstood, that nicotine itself can be harmful. One really important point that again goes overlooked is, so a traditional cigarette has, let's say, 11.9 to 14.5 milligrams of nicotine. A vape cartridge can contain 40 milligrams of nicotine. And on average, a person vaping can absorb about 50% of the nicotine in a vape. So the common phrase or conception is one vape has about 20 or 20 cigarettes worth of nicotine, right? So that's a really important consideration to make in terms of how much nicotine are in these cartridges. But in terms of their overall effect, they're very similar between devices.
Yeah. And recent studies also suggest that switching from traditional cigarettes to e-cigarettes may reduce exposure to toxic chemicals. So, how significant is this reduction with what you've shared in mind?
Yeah, I mean, several studies, including there was a 2015 Public Health England report, I believe. I forget the author. I believe it was McNeil, but they suggested that switching to e-cigarettes can reduce that exposure to some of the toxins found in cigarette smoke. Again, carbon monoxide, carcinogens being at the top of that list, but I believe 60 to 90% depending on the device. So user behavior being another factor, and whether the user fully quits smoking is another factor. But the reduction is most significant only when people completely switch. So not when they vape and smoke simultaneously, which is relatively common. That's a practice known as dual use. But dual users may contain or may continue to experience these substantial toxicant exposure elements. And so sometimes, even more than an exclusive smokers, depending on the pattern of the use, can be a factor. But while e-cigarettes can reduce some known carcinogens, they also introduce new toxic or toxicants. And so again, things like aldehydes and ultrafine metal particles are not found in traditional cigarette smoke, but are found in vaping devices.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I do have a few friends who used to be very, very regular heavy smokers who transitioned to vaping, but then they started vaping more, albeit exclusively, but still a lot more. So, what are the potential implications of that, like from going to traditional smoking, but not smoking as much, and then going to vaping, but but vaping a lot more?
Yeah. So if a former smoker fully switches to vaping and avoids returning to cigarette use, there may be some short term and some medium term benefits. So things like, or I guess because of reducing exposure to tar, to carbon monoxide, can lead to lower risk of lung and cardiovascular disease. It can also lead to improved lung function over time, especially in individuals with asthma or early on stage COPD, which is, again, very common amongst cigarette smokers. But potential concerns also remain, right? So nicotine addiction persists, often at higher doses due to nicotine salts in pod-based systems. Long-term effects on lung, on brain, and on cardiovascular systems are still unclear as well. So especially with prolonged exposure to aerosol flavorings, these types of agents and solvents can be very harmful. We just don't know to what extent yet, but that research is continuously being done and will be reported on long term. But yeah, dual use, so continued to exposure or expose users to nearly the same risks as smoking alone. It's just that relapse risk. So switching to smoking within a year, for example, if they don't use vaping as part of the structured cessation plan, can still be a concern.
Yeah. And I believe that one of the most well-known implications of vaping is popcorn lung. It's been talked about quite a bit now. And researchers have found that common vape or e-cigarette flavors can contain harmful chemicals that are associated with popcorn lung. So could you elaborate on what popcorn lung is, how, what the extent of the of popcorn lung goes, like where that goes and how detrimental it is to someone's health.
Yeah. I mean, so the concern really stems from diacetyl, which is a chemical once used to flavor microwave popcorn, which kind of gives it that name. So, workers exposed to high levels of diacetyl were developing this bronchitis. I believe it's bronchitis obliterative, but bronchitis being the main form, and that's now more commonly known as popcorn lung. And again, it's a rare, irreversible lung disease. And there was a 2016 study by Allen that found that over 75% of flavored e-cigarettes tested contained diacetyl or related compounds like pentanedione, 2,3 as well, both. And even when labels claimed otherwise. So a lot of cases they reported this, or they reported the lack of it being within the devices or the product, but they were still found to be consumed. And while the concentrations in e-cigarettes are lower than those found in industrial settings, chronic exposure to inhaled diacetyl, especially among adolescents, which is the target group here that is being affected most, still develop lung issues, and it remains, unfortunately, a public health concern in a number of different nations across the globe.
Yeah. So how do they compare to the implications of regular smoking?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how long they've been smoking at what age. So traditional cigarette smoke, again, contains a number of health effects because of the number of health chemicals within their devices or within the product. And so in a lot of cases, it can lead to increased blood pressure, higher risk of cardiovascular disease, a pneumothorax or a collapsed lung, pneumonias as well. So pneumonias are more common among vaping devices as compared to traditional cigarette smoke, but the risk is still there. And short term, we know that there is negative effects when it comes to traditional smoke, but short term for vaping devices, as it relates to popcorn lung, it can be just as simple as having a one-time use causing a collapsed lung, or multiple uses causing popcorn lung. But the long-term effects, again, we don't know quite enough yet because it hasn't been around as much. But those products are going to continue to evolve, unfortunately, because that's the nature of consumerism. And unfortunately, we as researchers, as public health professionals, need to do our best to stay on track of that, to educate the public and ensure that, at the end of the day, it's their decisions whether they do it or not, but they need to be the most informed.
Yeah, that's really well said. Yeah, I agree with you there. And harm reduction is often cited as the main justification for using e-cigarettes or switching to e-cigarettes as opposed to conventional smoking. But in your view, how effective is this approach, or has this approach been in promoting public health compared to other potential treatments?
Yeah, so harm reduction, when implemented responsibly, can be a powerful public health strategy. It's seen in areas like needle exchange programs and opioid substitution therapy. With e-cigarettes, the theory is sound. So offer adult smokers a less harmful way to consume nicotine. But the reality is more complex. So while some smokers quit using e-cigarettes, many become dual users, which blunts the benefits. If anything, it can sometimes increase the risk. And at the same time, e-cigarettes have become a really, unfortunately, a really strong gateway for youth, many of whom would have not smoked or have thought of smoking otherwise. And part of that is a nicotine addiction. Part of that is the social aspect. And it's not dissimilar to how traditional smoking or conventional smoking was 60, 70 years ago, as we saw the prevalence. And then we saw a big reduction, in the late or early 2000s, late 90s, sort of. We're kind of seeing that large incline now with vaping, and we're trying to mitigate that as best as we can.
And overall, there is a lot of debate as to whether or not e-cigarettes are actually safer than smoking, or if it's just a marketing ploy, which it could definitely be a little mix of both. As a health researcher and injury prevention specialist, what are your overall thoughts on this?
Yeah, great question. The answer is both. Vaping is likely safer than smoking when used as a complete substitute, but the industry, again, often backed by big tobacco, has strategically marketed e-cigarettes to maximize uptake, especially among young people. And now the more commonly used Zins, so the little patches that people would put in the sides of their cheeks and their mouths, again, a lot of nicotine is present there. They also have harmful effects. So, with vaping devices specifically, the focus on flavors, on sleek designs, as we talked about the evolution of these devices, and earlier on, celebrity influences made vaping more popular and more about lifestyle branding than public health. So claims of safety are often kind of overstated or cherry picked, with really little regard for long term evidence. And as a health researcher, I advocate for science first approach. So my approach is let's support adults trying to quit, but not at the expense of youth experimentation or misinformation, which is such a prevalent issue because of social media these days.
Yeah. And considering the current state of research on vaping and e cigarette use, what are the most critical unanswered questions regarding the long term health effects of e cigarettes?
Yeah, I would say the questions would be what are the long-term pulmonary and cardiovascular effects? How does adolescent exposure affect brain development? Right. Um, what is the impact of dual use? And can vaping genuinely lead to sustained smoking cessation? I think those are four really important questions that we need to be asking as health researchers, and the public should be asking of themselves and of their health professionals. To help dig further into this question because it's a really important one, and there's a lot of need for evidence to be taken.
Yeah. And with all of what you've shared with us in mind, what is your advice to listeners who are considering turning to e cigarettes or vaping as a safer alternative to smoking?
What advice? I mean, specifically to the vape users or to people that are trying
Yeah.
to switch?
People who are trying to switch.
Yeah. I mean, my advice would be don't do it in general. Not to don't switch, but don't smoke, don't vape. If you are going to switch over because you think it's going to help you quit the habit, I think it's one, be aware of the potential negative effects of vaping devices and be wary of that, both in terms of nicotine as well as the other chemicals that are present within those devices. If you generally think it's going to help you quit, I always say go an NRT route, go with other practical, evidence-backed approaches to help you cessate or reduce to, hopefully removal of the behavior. But if you are going to do it, ensure that you have a strong support system with you and ensure that your plan is to also eventually get off vaping devices because it's a little bit easier to control the amount of nicotine within those devices compared to traditional or conventional cigarettes use. But that should be part of your plan. It shouldn't be to switch just to this one because, again, we don't know the long-term effects necessarily. We know they most likely aren't great because we see short-term negative effects, but long-term, I don't see that changing into positive if it's not, not removed from the equation of their habits.
Yeah, and on top of that, just learning from my friends who do smoke and have switched to vaping in recent years, according to them, vaping is just a lot more convenient. They can do it at any place at any time, and they don't have to worry about people smelling the smoke on them. And so that leads them to use it a lot more than they should, or a lot more than they initially would have smoked with a traditional cigarette. So that's definitely something to consider as well. Now, I think it will be a perfect time to go into practices and habits, where we talk about the day-to-day application of what you would have, just shared with us. So, what is a habit that you would recommend practicing to quit smoking?
Yeah, I would recommend urge surfing. So it's a mindfulness based technique where you observe a craving without acting on it. It's a bit nuanced, right? A bit pseudo, but it does work, and there's evidence to back that. It's kind of like it's like a wave, right? So it builds, it peaks, it subsides. But I've found personally with my own behaviors, that this helps smokers disassociate from the sometimes automatic response or impulse to kind of light up a cigarette as soon as they see one or as soon as they have one in their fingers. And I think that's a strong form of trying to click something in the way that you think and reflect on what that is to be able to stop that urge and then hopefully continue to do that so the habit is no longer present.
That's really interesting. So, can you give us a couple of examples as to how this might look?
Yeah, so I mean, it can be just as simple as for myself, let's say I'm a smoker and I usually go smoke during my work breaks. So let's say I have two 15-minute breaks per day, not including lunch. And so every 15-minute break, I want to go out and have a smoke. In this case, let's say there are no other social influences. It's just my decision to go. And let's say I go out. So what I would do if I want to enact this urge surfing is that I would have a cigarette in my hand. I would be sitting outside and I would observe the behavior, but I wouldn't act on it. I wouldn't light up the cigarette. You could put it next to your mouth or into your mouth if you wanted to kind of have that feeling of smoking, and putting it back down, and then eventually throwing it out and then going back in as you would if you were actually smoking. And then that would be a way of fighting the urge. And it's not always easy, but it's a way of fighting the urge to smoke or to light up, but still giving you the behavior as it's part of your impulse to light it up. So that's one way that you could do it and how it would fit your schedule.
Yeah. And what are some of the most common challenges that people face when trying to urge stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult and high stress moments, right? So if you're working in an environment that's relatively high stress, if you're working in the financial district, for example, and some individuals, just need a break, and that smoking is what they use as their kind of time away from work or to kind of shut off their brains before going back into work for the next few hours. So that's one big difficulty, and then doing it without a support system is another, right? So oftentimes people want to go into this really hard thing alone, and oftentimes they try to do it cold turkey. Neither of those ways are effective, or nor should they be promoted, because there's so many other avenues to go, especially given the research supporting quitting. There's a lot of resources across the globe, but especially in Western countries like Canada, like USA, and going out east to Australia, New Zealand, and so on. There are so many opportunities to help cessate that behavior and use resources from provincial or from the state level to the federal level, or just regional public health authorities.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned, that example scenario of in high stress moments going for a break, because that reminded me of how peer pressure can be a huge factor as to how likely someone is to stop smoking. I have a few friends in the finance and accounting industry, and they have all these parties where everyone would be smoking, like half the people there would be smoking, or a lot of people in the team would go for smoke breaks, and it's a motivator to ironically bond like
Yeah.
just unofficially, and especially if you're just starting out in your career, you can really be pulled into the fact that like this is a good way to bond with the team, right? So what is your advice for I suppose just trying to mitigate that and trying to resist that temptation?
Yeah, that's a great question, and probably the one of the largest influences to those behaviors, right? Alcohol being another really common example of the social aspect of it. There's no one answer that I can say that everyone will be like, that's the way that it should be done. I think it's on an individual basis. What I would say is ask yourself why. Why do you want to quit? That's the foundation of your decision, and it has to be your decision to be able to do that. No one's going to make that for you, and no one's going to monitor you 24/7 to make sure you don't smoke. So number one, ask yourself why. Number two, there's a concept from a book called Atomic Habits that talks about how to promote behavior change on an effective level. So it talks about making something easy, making it obvious, making it attractive, and making it satisfying. Okay. So in order to help yourself promote this cessation of behavior, it's to find opportunities to enact those principles, whether it's giving yourself a reward every time you don't do it. And that can be something as simple as, texting your mom to say, I didn't do it today, right? Or I didn't do it when I went out tonight. That could be a small example of an incentive for yourself, making it obvious. So it could be something as simple of, on your pack of smokes, you have, let's say, a sentence or a little line that reminds you of your reason why. That's another example of something that can motivate you to stop, or to continue to fight the urge to smoke. And the other is, try your best to stay away from social constructs where that might be an influence. Or if you are going out with your close friends, you mentioned that some of your close friends do smoke, communicate that with them. And, hopefully they're supportive of you wanting to quit. And so they can help you push that forward. And if not, then part of the solution might have to be to separate yourself, at least at the start, to be able to provide yourself enough leeway and a runway to kind of remove that habit.
Right. Well, thank you for sharing all of that with us, Babac. It's been exceptionally enlightening to me, and I think now would be a great time to move on to the open mic segment, and this will be your chance to talk about anything that you're passionate about, and it doesn't have to be related to the topic. So the floor is entirely yours. Take it away.
Of course, yeah. I think so. A lot of my work now is obviously has previously been in vaping and smoking, and still a lot of work is being done in that area. A lot of our work is now done on physical activity and health behavior change. So I talked a bit about behavioral economics and how that influences health behavior change overall. The one aspect I really want to focus on, and I'm not sure if I was able to talk about it or if I thought to talk about it, but it was, the regulations that are being put in place. And so, for example, in the Canadian market, in June of 2023, and this should just provide a lens of where we're at with this behavior, right? So this is really new, 2 years ago, right? So June of 2023, it was Health Canada had finally introduced regulations requiring manufacturers to disclose information about their vaping products, including the sales data, including the ingredient list. Like, that's crazy that they didn't have to do that beforehand, right? But that finally came into place. And so the initiative that Health Canada put in place was to enhance the government's understanding of the vaping market and then inform policies to protect public health, again, especially among youth and non-smokers. So that's a really important case. I think people need to continue to bring back, is that this is a new behavior. We're just catching up to it. And the industry is a decade ahead of us, right? So unfortunately, that's public health in a lot of ways, but that is also where information and health education is so important. And myself and yourself, Marie, this is where we can come in to help. I don't like to use the word educate. That's not a good word, but to inform the public of what the negative and sometimes positive health outcomes can be, and then they can make the decision on their own, and meet them where they are.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And Australia actually pretty recently, I think in the last year, banned the sale of vapes. So there isn't any readily available information about vape sales or just vapes in general that are like a very small pool of legally used, no, vapes that are legally being sold through pharmacies and stuff like that. But apart from that, it's really hard to find information on vapes in general. So I wonder if that would be something good to have in Australia as well. But either way, thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us. It has been really eye-opening, and I hope it has been for the listeners as well. And if our listeners want to find you, find out more about you, what you do, etc., where can they go?
Yeah, I mean, they can always reach out to me on Twitter at Babac Salmani, very simple, or LinkedIn. I'm always active on LinkedIn as well. So if anyone has any questions relating to vaping, to smoking, to physical activity and health promotion in general, or you're just curious about all of this, I'm more than willing to lend an ear and to speak a bit about my experience and my experience in research as well. And yeah, again, thank you so much, Marie, for your time. And I love what you guys are doing. And I hope you just continue to do it to have a positive impact. And tell the listeners out there, don't be shy, reach out. I'm a proud, friendly Canadian. So, I'm always here.
Thank you. We appreciate that. And thank you everyone for tuning in. We'll leave the links to all of Babac's work and social media in the show notes. So we'll catch you in the next episode.
You have been listening to Aging Less, the Longevity Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website at longevity.lifemanagementsciencelabs.com, where you can join our movement. I'm Marie Stella. Thanks for tuning in.